I'm going to talk about how to set up your zones for heart rate training. 5.34 miles, 8 minutes, 46 seconds per mile, and 140 beats per minute today. Taking on another nice and easy day during this recovery phase for me. Heart rate staying in the easy range, which for me is, I would consider for me around 130 to 145 beats per minute. So at 140 beats per minute today, I was squarely right in there. And that leads me right into today's topic, which is how to set up zones. You might have heard of these before, like zones 1 through 5 for heart rate training. Before I do that, I do want to go over some disclaimers. I'm not a coach, I'm not certified as a coach, and I'm not anybody's coach. I've never coached anyone before. I'm just someone that writes their own training plans, has done personal research on figuring out what these different things are, and I currently do train by heart rate. So with the disclaimers out of the way, let's talk about setting up zones for heart rate training. First, I want to talk about very just briefly, if you've never heard about heart rate training before, why you would want to do it. A video that I made earlier this week talked about setting up different training pace zones depending on the kind of training plan that you have. And I talked about easy runs, threshold runs, interval runs, and repetitions, and kind of the differences between all those and what they do. The question that came up a couple of times, and I think one of the strengths of using heart rate training is, what if it's really hot, like in the summertime, or what if it's really hilly or humid where you live, and it's harder to run, say, a 6-minute mile or a 7-minute mile on some days than it is on other days, or some of your miles might be on uphill portions of your run and some might be on downhill. How do you account really for that to make sure you're getting in the exact right kind of activity and stimulus to your body that you're looking for? And when you're doing pace training, there really isn't a way. The pace is the pace. You either hit it or you don't. It's kind of a limitation to it. I think that it's not necessarily that inflexible or necessarily flawed of a system, because you can always kind of adjust yourself and kind of run a little bit by feel in terms of your effort. But that's kind of a little bit less of a concrete way of saying, like, let's adjust it for the terrain and conditions. And that's what heart rate training really does. The heart rate, it measures what your heart is doing, what your cardiovascular system is doing. And so what might be a 6-minute mile on completely flat, cool terrain could be a 6-minute 30-second mile or 6-minute 45-second mile, or even 7, 8, 9 minutes, depending on how steep that incline is, or how high of an altitude you might be at, or how hot of a day you might be experiencing. So there's a certain number of beats per minute that your heart will kind of put out at a given level of effort. And if you shoot to train by that level of effort, no matter what kind of conditions you are running in, you know that you're getting the same level of exertion to your body, or you're putting the same strain on your body, which is like the point of what a lot of these very specific and fine-tuned workouts are trying to do. So there's a couple of different ways of approaching heart rate training. And one of the biggest kind of like pitfalls that a lot of people have is that there isn't necessarily a great way of determining what the zones are. And there's quite a bit of kind of debate, new research, and also kind of like dispute over what's the best way. And I think the short answer is, because what we're doing here is we're looking at a very specific and fine-tuned, I guess the long answer is a very specific and fine-tuned way of looking at what my body is doing or what your body is doing. There isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to it. So the closest thing to a one-size-fits-all approach is a very specific tailored test. That's the VO2 max test. It's something where you get on a treadmill, they put all this like gear on you, they measure your input and your output in terms of the gases that are going in and out of your system, and it comes up with a number, and it'll help you figure out what your max heart rate is, which is what is then used to calculate like the zones. It's really, I don't know how expensive it is, but it is one of the things that I wanted to do for 2020, but a lot of people's plans for 2020 running wise and otherwise took a weird turn. So that's not something that I've done yet. The other way though of figuring out what kind of your heart rate baselines are to establish some of these zones is going to be a couple of different methods. There's like a more standard formula in terms of determining an estimate of what your heart rate max is, or how fast the fastest that your heart can beat for some level of sustained activity. And that's to take 220 minus your age. I'm 40, so for me that would put my max heart rate at 180. Another way of looking at approaching heart rate training is not to figure out what your max heart rate is. Another one is to use Maffetone training, which uses a slightly different formula, which starts out at 180 and then subtracts your age and has like modifiers depending on your current level of fitness and health. And so for me, it would be 180 minus, again, my age, which is 40, puts me at 140. Plus or minus 5. I'm very healthy in terms of being able to run without injury, and I don't get sick really. So I added 5 to it. So my base number for Maffetone style training is 145. And we'll kind of talk about that as we start filling in some of the zones. A third way of determining a number to kind of start with for heart rate training is the Jack Daniels approach, which is similar that a lot of other coaches use. They might say, like, if you're doing a 5K, measuring what your max heart rate is towards like the second third of that 5K or towards the end of it. The other way that Jack Daniels recommends is run a couple of hills and then see what your heart rate is when you're at the top of the hill and your heart is beating as fast as it can. Then run another hill. And then if the heart rate doesn't increase, it's the same, that's your max heart rate. So that's kind of a way to do it. Run a bunch of hills, or he says if you don't have hills available to you, you can do a whole bunch of 800s and kind of do the same thing there. I think the reason he picks hills is that it's less strain on the body and you more quickly get your test result that way. So whether you're using a more heart rate max approach or the Maffetone approach, which uses kind of like a heart rate medium, that's kind of like going to be your starting point. And I'll kind of do two different like analysis in terms of setting up these zones. So what I have is I'll start with the 180, which is the 220 minus my age, and I'll set that as kind of somewhere about where my heart rate maximum is. From there, you establish your easy, threshold, interval, and repetition zones by using percentages of that max. And I'll again use some of Jack Daniels numbers to set up what some of these like percentages are. There's a little bit of variation in there depending on like different sources. Runner's World has some that I think are a little bit on the low side. Polar has some like that are default set up in the watch that I think the zones are a little bit wider than I think makes a little bit of sense. Maybe they're not specifically tuned for runners, but maybe just for just athletes or people looking for fitness in general. But you can always like kind of tweak them. The Jack Daniels ones are ones that I kind of picked that I would use for the purpose of this video. And it turned out that they actually match up with kind of some of the numbers that I've been using with my Maffetone approach. So that's kind of why I'll use that. It seems to line up with what's been making sense to me from training with heart rate for the last, almost a year now. So the first zone is the easy zone, which will be about 65 to 79% of your max heart rate. So mine's 180. So those numbers are going to turn out to be 117 to 142 beats per minute. That's where I should be doing the most of my running. That'll give me a nice aerobic benefit. It'll also be good for my recovery runs. Usually my recovery runs are around 130. And today's run was 140. So that puts me squarely in the easy zone. Then for the next zone that I really take a look at, like specifically for training, I use a polarized approach, more of an 80-20. I don't spend a lot of time in that zone 3, so I'll skip to kind of zone 4, which is threshold. And the threshold for Jack Daniels numbers that he uses is 88 to 92% of your max heart rate. So again, plugging that into my 180 gives me a 158 to a 165 heart rate range, which I think lines up really nicely for me in my kind of experience. We're trying to run that threshold pace, which is that pace where your system starts switching over a little bit more from aerobic to anaerobic. It's a pace that you can maintain kind of for about an hour before your body really starts to kind of shut down, and that kind of makes sense for me at those numbers. For interval training, Jack Daniels has those numbers at 97.5 to just about to 100% of your heart rate maximum. And the point of those is to really start loading that anaerobic system. We're working more of the musculoskeletal system there as well, but there's still some aerobic workout and benefit in there. And those numbers for me translate to about 175 and up towards my heart rate max. And then there are repetitions or really, really short, intense intervals, something closer to about mile pace, where you're really focusing on that musculoskeletal system. There really isn't any aerobic involvement at all. It's almost going to be completely anaerobic because the intensity is so high. You just can't get enough oxygen to fuel that level of activity. That's going to be at my heart rate max, which is at like 100. So basically pegged for working my heart. So that's the different intensities that you work at. What pace does that correlate to? It doesn't matter. That's the whole point of the heart rate training, is that it really doesn't matter what it correlates to, because maybe you're feeling a little bit fatigued because you didn't get enough sleep, your nutrition hasn't been right, humidity, heat, altitude, incline, decline, headwind, tailwind, all those things get factored into account. And the idea is to run your easy runs at that easy heart rate threshold, at threshold heart rate, etc. So that's the whole point. How does that line up to my Maffetone? Now, the way that Maffetone works, instead of giving you like a percentage of heart rate max that you can work at, you're then given your easy zone, or your max speed limit for easy, or I guess effort limit for speed limit. So for me, that's 145 beats per minute, and that's kind of the max that I'll go for the majority of my runs, which are my easy runs. Today's was 140, so definitely staying within that. At that point, it's a little bit harder to figure out what the threshold, interval, and repetitions pace are. Repetitions is easy. You kind of just run hard. It's mile pace, so you're running a pretty hard effort. Not necessarily an all-out sprint, but as far as distance runners go, mile race pace is kind of as close as I get to an all-out sprint anyway. And so that's kind of easy. That's kind of like the 180 and above. So how do I figure out those threshold and those interval paces? For me, that came from a lot of experience, and that's something that I think that you can kind of mimic as well, in terms of going back to paces and kind of estimating from there in your current level of fitness. These zones might change as your cardiac fitness improves over time too. I don't think that they move all that much. They think they move probably more with age than they do with fitness, but this is kind of where they are. And here's where they were for me. I found that for me, right around that 165 beats per minute mark, that's about where I could maintain that for an hour before I would really start to either hit the wall or just have a hard time like doing anything at that point. Things kind of fall apart. One of the experiences that I had with that was at the Houston Marathon, where I was running a little bit hot for a large majority of the race. Basically for about a little bit more than an hour, I was running above 165 in terms of my heart rate, thinking like, you know what, I really wanted to hit a certain pace. This is where I need to be. I think, you know what, I can go out on a limb and try and like beat the numbers, so to speak. But after about an hour, 10 minutes, hour, 15 minutes of that, that's where things really started to take a decline. I hit the wall and, ended up doing a lot of run walking from the rest of that point in on the race. So that kind of tells me, that's what I maintained for about an hour. That's about what my threshold pace is. So that's kind of where I set that at. Then for my intervals, I look at it as being closer to 175. And there I'm kind of like cheating to kind of figure it out. I'm looking at some paces that I've run on cool days, on flat surfaces, and figuring out what that interval pace and the heart rate that corresponds to that is. And so I've looked at different paces that I've run where I'm running between that half marathon and 10K pace and seeing what heart rate numbers that corresponds to. And that puts me somewhere in like the 170 to 175 range. So that's what I generally use there. And from what I've seen, it's not quite my max heart rate and it's not quite my threshold pace either. So it's kind of in the middle there at 170 to 175. Then for my max, I think my max is somewhere probably closer to 182, 183. I don't spend a lot of time at that heart rate. So that's something that I do need to look a little bit closer at, but I think it's somewhere in that 182 to 183 range. So that's how I set up my zones. It was a little bit trickier with Maff because Maff has like a really big onboarding process time. And so it's very frustrating to kind of figure things out. And it seems like all the numbers are constantly moving and not making sense. But after having done Maffetone for me for a while, these are some of the kind of pace ranges that make sense. And I think I've been doing low heart rate training long enough at this point where kind of like training by pace intensities versus heart rate zone intensities are kind of lining up, and I'm getting like the same kind of result either way. If I had tried to do that with heart rate training like 4 or 5 months ago, it would have been like the pace zones would have had me at way higher heart rates than my heart rate zones would have allowed. So there was a little bit of a disconnect, and that's where I think a lot of people get frustrated with heart rate training, is because before it can really make sense, you have to really master that aerobic and easy zone. At least that's been my experience. And so now at this point, they are making a little bit more sense in terms of the numbers, and I feel like now I have a system that I can use that can take into account some of the rolling hills that are out here. Here it's Iowa. Most people think it's flat fields of corn, which in the large part it is, but on the eastern part of Iowa where we are, it is a little bit hilly. So I'm getting quite a bit more elevation change here in New Vienna that I was getting in Chicago, for example. Not as much as I was getting about 20 minutes down the road from Guttenberg, Iowa, which is where we were spending at least a part of the summer earlier this season, where it's a lot hillier because there's bluffs over by the Mississippi River there. So on all of those, I can always kind of use that heart rate zone to kind of figure out, am I working the right amount? So that's how I've set that all up. If you have any questions about that, feel free to leave it in the comments down below. In the next video in this kind of series, it won't be tomorrow's video, but in a couple of days, I'll have another video that talks about power, which is another way that takes into account incline, decline, and elevation changes. So that's something that I'll be using, like the third in kind of like this series of kind of a dabbler's view on how to set up zones by different methods. So hopefully that's been helpful for you guys. That's all I have for today, everybody. Thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of the video. Hopefully you guys are staying safe out there on your runs, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yo, what's going on?